This is a blast. I love this. Oh my God, we're talking about nationalism and populism. Are you kidding me? And the Greeks? Let's go. I'm Michael Shellenberger. I'm CBR Chair of Politics, Censorship, and Free Speech at the University of Austin, and this is Return of the Strong Gods. I chose this book. This is my favorite book right now. I'm not saying it's the book that's influenced me the most or it's the most important book in my life, but it's the book I'm thinking a lot about right now. This is a book that was written in 2019. It really describes well the victory of Trump, the ascendance to power of Trump in 2016, and also of other populist nationalist parties around the world. So if you want to understand what's happening at this very moment, which is arguably the biggest story in the world, probably is the biggest story in the world, this is a guidebook to that. This isn't like my favorite book. This isn't the book that's influenced me the most. But for me, this is the book that best explains the times we're living through right now. This is a book about nationalism. It's written by the editor of a magazine called First Things. And the idea basically is that we've lived under a particular set of ideas since World War II, that very understandably we got out of World War II, out of the Holocaust, out of the horrors of 40 million deaths out of World War II. And the American establishment in particular, both on the left and the right, felt it was very important to sort of tamp down intense feelings in general and intense dogmas, whether religious dogmas or political dogmas, whether communism or fascism. And so this is really an intellectual history of the post-war 1945 until really the book was written in 2019. I think the book was probably published and sort of forgotten and has been rediscovered now by a number of folks, including us, also N.S. Lyons, who writes for Substack a lot about China and about the changing world order. But the idea is, and one of the ideas that we've been exploring at UATX and in our class on pathocracy, is how bad things can come out of good things, how good people can do bad things, and how bad ideas can come out of good ideas, or bad ideas can come out of good ideas if they just go too far, or if they apply to areas where they shouldn't apply. And one of the characteristics that the post-war period was responding to was totalitarianism, which Hannah Arendt very famously described as sort of the penetration by politics of every domain of life, into family, into culture, that everything had to be fascist or communist, and that was a big part of what totalitarianism was. So this book argues that with the return of nationalism and populism by President Trump and by other populist nationalists around the world, that you're seeing the return of strong gods, by which the author means literally gods, religious gods, old-time religions, but also the idea of the nation as a community of a sovereign community of fundamentally equal individuals with a common identity. And for me, this really explains both the rise of Trump, the power of Trump, the fact that this book kind of comes out in 2020. I think it's kind of forgotten because people think after Trump loses the elections that was just a sort of aberration, 2016 to 2020, that was just a kind of weird moment that we'll just do best to forget. And really what this book is arguing is that the Trump presidency signifies the end of a particular period, an 80-year period from 1945 to 2025, where we wanted to emphasize globalization, we wanted to emphasize pluralism of ideas, what you might even call a moral relativism, this idea that we're all sort of more human than we are American, that our primary identity should be a global identity, that people should be able to cross borders freely, that goods should be able to cross borders freely. This was the consensus for a really long time on both the left and the right. And over time, it gave rise to what many of us, including myself, view as a form of totalitarianism, a kind of censorship, a global censorship demanded by the European Union and the U.S. government, a kind of warfare to prevent populist political candidates from even running for office. We saw that against Trump, but we also see now they've canceled the elections in Romania, where a presidential candidate who's a nationalist populist was on the verge of winning. And we just see this kind of encroachment, a desire for us to have digital passports where we have to, that would monitor our social media posts and also decide whether we got into countries. It would measure whether or not we are vaccinated. legitimated or not. And these systems of control started to come in that were basically anathema, that were the opposite of what the United States and others wanted to promote after World War II. So it's really a story, it's a classic tragic story, or this kind of a heroic figure at the beginning, at that 1945 period, that's championing freedom and tolerance and pluralism, comes to become the very thing that it had fought against, which was totalitarianism. So Return of the Strong Gods, an amazing book. I encourage you guys to read it. And yeah, with that, I think would love to get your thoughts and comments on it.
When you say strong gods, does he literally mean the Greek gods? And if so, how does that manifest in society?
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't necessarily say it's all about the Greek gods or the Christian god or the Jewish god or the Hindu gods or whatever it might be, but he's saying those traditional religions have certainly come back in a strong way to, demand their recognition. And it's not just the traditional religions like the Christian Church, the Catholic Church. It's really about a deeper set of mythologies and myths that gave rise to the West. So a lot of the things that we've been studying here about the ancient virtues of courage, of truth, of justice, these are things that were seen as sources of dogma and too much intensity after World War II. The idea was that all of that was just too much. We needed a kind of weaker set of values, a stronger focus on science and rationality, and not on this kind of heroism that you see celebrated in the ancient Greek, because that was that was viewed as sort of contiguous with totalitarianism, or the kind of giving rise to these authoritarian figures. So it's definitely a return of those more ancient virtues and values, as well as those traditional religions. And I see this particularly, I don't know if you guys have seen, but in the last few days, more and more data has come out about how people voted in the last elections. And it turns out that basically everybody under 25 is more conservative, has voted more conservative than baby boomers, but really any of the older generations. We'd seen that a lot of young men in particular have been in a backlash against a kind of overly feminized prioritization of feminine values, and men you see this rise of the manosphere and Joe Rogan and Andrew Tate, and a kind of sense of manliness coming back. So I think that's also one of the strong gods, is a kind of sense of manliness. But then I think at the heart of it is just this idea of the nation. That's the main way that we're connected in so many ways, and we've forgotten about that because we are so global. We travel around the world. We have products from elsewhere. Very few things are produced here. They're produced in China. So a sense in which really it's not just American pride, but really like America and the nation state is our fundamental place where we are organized and collective, not through the United Nations, not through the World Economic Forum, not through the European Union.
Can I ask one more follow-up question to that? Wait, so we were talking about how we have new set of values that are, you'd probably say, the softer values like harm and scientism and so is that now mixing with the return to the strong gods, or are we actually returning to the because you say in class that you can't appeal to like God says this is bad or that, so are we just have a new language for old virtues, or we have new virtues that are mixing with this old thing?
Excellent question. I think there's sort of two things going on. On the one hand, yeah, as you mentioned, the really dominant values in our society and that have been dominant for decades have been the values of sort of care and compassion. To some extent, that's just part of the Christian Western tradition, is the reaction to the Roman, values. I don't know what they call that. Just the very overly emphasis on strength and domination, and much more about care. But that's become sort of a central value, at least, for many modern people. And then the other one, this sort of, thinner sense of individualism, or sort of individual self-creation, that sort of, hey, it's up to you. You do what you want to do, whatever feels good. It's all up to you. It's very kind of thin and weak. It doesn't have that strong sense of no, you should be courageous. You should be truth-telling. You should have these deeper, more ancient virtues. So those are coming back. But I think fundamentally, there is some evidence that there's a slight increase in the number of people that believe in God over the last few years. But really the big thing is just the return of a sense that we're Americans. And so, when you see this recent effort by Trump to try to get peace in the Ukraine, and there's a conflict in the Oval Office between him and the Ukrainians, and you see a whole debate over what is our obligation there, there's just overwhelmingly a sense right now in the country, and that led to the election of Trump, that we're overextended. we're trying to be police officer to the world, and we've got a lot of really wounded veterans here, some of whom we see on the streets, of Austin, or you see around the country, struggling with addiction, struggling with mental illness. We have, a deep needs here in terms of educating our young people, in terms of making our universities free again. And so there's a sense in which it's not just necessarily just a turning inward, but it's a sense in which, that America, I think more than Christianity or any other religion is where our focus and where our orientation should be. Yeah.
So you talked about return of the strong gods could also mean return of the manly men, and in class we talked about how there's weak men, manly men, gentlemen. Yeah. So do you think it's only going to be the rise of manly men like Andrew Tate, or do you think there's a chance that it could also be the rise of gentlemen?
Super interesting question, and one of the books I love and could also have easily have done here is Manliness by the great former Harvard professor of emeritus Harvey Mansfield. And his idea, as you said, it's sort of that you have really three classes of men: weak men who are too weak to defend themselves or others, manly men who have aggression and violence and are capable of defending themselves and others but can't control it and will engage in cruelty and even sadism just to express their own power. And then the gentleman who is capable of violence and aggression but is able to control it and would never abuse his powers to take advantage of people that he could take advantage of. And it's a really lovely kind of picture. And I do think that there is this big question that's happening right now about what is a man in this? What should a man be? What's the highest exemplar of men? And you do have this huge attraction to Andrew Tate, and on the one hand, coming out of a ultimate fighting sort of sport that on the one hand it has a lot of discipline and even beauty to it, but on the other hand has some scoundrels, I would say, like Andrew Tate, who's been strongly suspected of sex trafficking and violence against women. But then you also have characters like Jordan Peterson, who's now one of the most famous, maybe the most famous public intellectual in the world, who's trying to represent a different kind of manliness through a gentlemanliness. So we hope, we certainly see in Trump and Elon both of those manifestations, I would say. On the one hand, manly men who will be very aggressive and strong, but also I think have been capable of rising to a higher level of wisdom. And in fact, as soon as this meeting ends, I'm about to go publish an article raising some concerns about the Trump administration starting to potentially abuse some of their powers, at least on free speech and privacy and on separation of powers. So I think that we are on a knife's edge, and it would be a tragedy for those who have ushered in the return of strong gods to abuse those powers and to not heed the warnings that they are engaged in hubris or arrogance or too much pride, because there is a lot of pride from the people that had felt really put down over the last 10 years and are now in power and in a position to use it. Yeah.
Do we see this oscillating pattern sort of throughout history where, after World War II, people became more progressive, it was more, freedom of choosing yourself, weaker values, and now we're at the end of this period where these more conservative, traditional values are coming back? Is this like an individual point in history, or is this part of a larger pattern where we go too progressive and then too conservative and then keep on pushing back and forth? And if that is a pattern, will we ever reach an end?
It's a great question. It came up in class a lot, too. I mean, it's sort of the only way to really properly understand the current moment in many ways, including the triumph of Trump and the MAGA coalition, is through the lens of Greek tragedy. That you can sort of look at the polling data and you can say, well, the young people are moving in this direction and the boomers are getting older, and there's these differences between women and men. But when you really when you pull back and you just look at what's happened over the last decade, what you see is a heroic journey by the President of the United States, like him or dislike him, in the sense that he only achieved his high levels of power. Because remember, he won the popular vote. They got a majority of Republicans in the Congress. There's a majority of conservative Supreme Court justices. There's not a lot in the way of that coalition other than maybe themselves. And so, so I think if you really understand that, you kind of go, how did Trump come to power? It was thanks to his enemies. This is one of the great this is one of the great contributions of tragedy. One of the great contributions of the Greeks is that the hero and his enemies are aligned in this journey. They're in a deep relationship. So if Trump, Trump's incredible power right now, he would have had a fraction of that had he actually been reelected in 2020. Instead, the January 6th happened. People basically said that Trump was done for. The New York Post ridiculed him. New York Post being one of the most important sort of center-right or conservative newspapers just ridiculed Trump. You had the Florida governor openly criticizing him, running to compete for him. They then raided his home in Mar-a-Lago, Florida, which is just the FBI raided his home, which is just unprecedented in American history. I mean, even if you think he maybe should have cooperated more than Biden, I mean, Biden basically had similar kinds of documents at his house. They went into the bedroom of a former president of the United States, which in our history is a very shocking thing to do, trying to put somebody in prison, trying to keep him off the ballot. These are things that we really hadn't seen the system do against a sitting or former president in American history, all of it in the context of the intelligence community having abused its powers to spy on Trump, to falsely accuse him of being a puppet of Putin because of some supposed sex blackmail operation. I mean, it's an incredible story when you pull back to it. And the entire time, the left is being warned by people in their coalition that they were going too far, that they were transgressing, that they were engaged in hubris and arrogance. And Trump's one of his most famous statements he made, and he made it repeatedly, was he said, they're not coming for me, they're coming for you, and I'm in their way. And so the sense was that he ended up, and then then of course you have this shocking, incredible assassination attempt on live television. I mean, it's really like the Greeks have nothing on the Trump saga over the last decade. And I think the public's reaction was, the deep state, the Democrats, the administrative state, it's out of control. And we just, we need a tough guy. And that a lot of the support for Trump wasn't that he was even a good guy, or even, much less a kind of traditional hero, that he was really a tough guy. He was like Tony Soprano or Walter White in Breaking Bad, that he was somebody you wanted precisely because he was so tough and rough that you knew he would stand up against a larger threat. So, I think this is also an incredibly important moment for Trump, whether he can go beyond that anti-hero status and become the wise king. I mean, just to complete the drama, we had a mad king as our president until a couple of months ago. I mean, just how crazy and symbolic the entire episode has been. But yeah, I think that it's like every moment that's happening, we're in an accelerated timeline the next, I think, 5 or 10, maybe 15 years. And then after that, things will calm down. But people that want to kind of imagine we know what will happen next, we have no idea, because it could go either way, both for the president and I think for his opposition.
In our writing in the English language class, we listened to a lot of speeches from Dr. Martin Luther King, and we analyzed how he spoke. Many of us came to the conclusion that it's sort of the way a demagogue would speak, and because he had some excellent message to say, the speaking like a demagogue wasn't a problem, because it's very emotionally attaching for his audience. And one big question was, do we need more of this theater and emotional speaking in America, or do we need someone like Trump who's more like practical and lower level speaking for everyone to understand, but perhaps less emotional?
Well, really interesting question. I mean, I see Trump as a very emotional person. He shouts, he gets angry in public. He's transgressive in that way. I mean, especially if you think back to Obama, who was so cool and so calm and collected, and you would tell when you get a little bit annoyed, but it was never that real, anger that you see, the volcanic anger really from Trump. So for me, Trump's a very emotional person, and I think that's actually one of his challenges, is to sort of start to transcend that and become a bit more of a wiser, calmer person, because I do think that anger, on the one hand, is often justified. I mean, he really was persecuted. There's no doubt about it. On the other hand, we all know that anger can blind you. It literally narrows your vision speaking from personal experience, and doing things that you regret later, acting in passion. So I think that is one of his challenges. I thought the other thing was so interesting about the comparison is that both Martin Luther King and Trump were very skilled at speaking to core American values. Martin Luther King is constantly appealing to nationalist values. I mean, there's an argument that King was a nationalist. I think he's certainly a populist. I think we sometimes call the populists that we don't like demagogues, and sometimes populism has had a kind of bad name to it. But they both spoke to American traditions, and then of course King spoke directly to the Judeo-Christian tradition and the sense of a kind of persecuted people, finally gaining equality and dignity and equal status. And I think that's a lot of what Trump was about too. He was defending the people that the Democrats thought and sometimes said were the deplorables, morally deplorable people, inferior to the elites that would travel to Davos and to Brussels and to London, have conferences and go to Aspen and decide who should have a right to speak and what they should have a right to say, and that they would be mass censored and having the vote deprived and basically disparaged as domestic extremists and terrorists for 8 years. And Trump sort of lifted up their dignity and said, these are, also real Americans that deserve recognition and respect. And the disrespect that they received for so long, and then the love and respect that Trump gave them, was what bonded them to him and allowed for him to have this incredible sense of gravity. So he could be, discredited in the mind of the mainstream and the establishment, but his own people would be with him so much that any other Republican candidate that tried to steal away votes, there was just too much gravity swirling around Trump and too much power and influence. And, ultimately that was just able to grow to the point where by the end there he had two of the country's most famous liberal Democrats in his coalition, Tulsi Gabbard and Bobby Kennedy Jr. And as we see now, again, I mentioned this new polling that's been coming out. It is a little bit like what a lot of people suspected, but we couldn't prove, which is that there was just a lot of Democrats and liberals that voted for Trump. So I think both men, in the sense, they both had their low moments too. In King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, he talked really resentfully and angrily about the debt that America owed to him. And then the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson was behind him, and she had heard him kind of riffing on the "I Have a Dream" speech for like a few weeks before that, and she just yells out from the back of the dais, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And you can see him on the video. You can't hear her, but you can kind of see him go, "All right." And at that point, he gives the "I Have a Dream" speech, and I think that's sort of the speech that I think we finally saw from Trump as well when he addressed Congress. It was much more uplifting. It wasn't as bitter as his convention speech was. So I do think that they both have those bright mountaintops to reach for. Trump, I think, is still reaching for it, but huge amounts in common between both men.
That's an excellent answer. Another element in King's speeches is that he'll call on fringe groups, not necessarily like fringe extreme, but parts of political parties that he wants to join in his team, like moderate people in the South or parts of the liberal coalition or whatever it may be, NAACP. Right now we seem to have like two kinds of beliefs. Either you're left or right, or maybe you're somewhere in the middle and you don't want to say that you're either one because they're too extreme. Do you see like a combination of the two in the future, or maybe more splinter groups?
A combination of both left and right, you mean? Or
because maybe a middle party because of these two extremes, or do you see maybe more smaller groups of people who believe specific things, like the groups that MLK called on?
I think that definitely we're in this disorienting moment in many ways, where I described once when I first testified to Congress about free speech and censorship, I described how disorienting and confusing it was for me to have to defend free speech. That seemed like something that an American would never have to do, to make the case for why you should have free speech. I've also felt disoriented as, someone that came from the left, was on the left. To be on the left when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s meant you were for free speech, you were against U.S. involvement in foreign wars, you were very suspicious of the intelligence community in general, and the FBI and CIA in particular. Well, now here we have a supposedly far-right coalition. I mean, that's the label it's been given, that that is the Trump coalition, or similarly in Europe, that's for radically higher levels of free speech, that's against the politicization of the intelligence community, that wants to pull us out of foreign wars. So these positions, they've just changed sides. And then it's even more complicated than that, because, I mean, when Trump first ran, not only did he say that the Iraq war was a mistake, against what many Republicans still believed at the time, he also said that he defended Social Security and Medicare, which were two of these entitlements that every American has a right to. He defended them against Republicans who had been often trying to privatize or get rid of them. And that was significant in part because what he was saying is, these are things that we have in common as American citizens, and he wanted to really emphasize that. So nationalism, which had been demonized as a far-right phenomenon, as basically, Nazi adjacent, is neither actually right or left. It's always been a kind of consciousness, at least according to Leah Greenfeld, who's written some of the best books on it. It's a new form of consciousness that actually establishes that all of us, by dint of our citizenship, are fundamentally equal individuals with a shared identity. That we take it for granted as Americans, but before that, in Britain and France and all these other countries, they didn't see the people in their country as fundamentally equal at all. They thought the nobility were blue bloods, literally had different color blood and could only marry each other, which is why you had so much inbreeding. And then there was sort of the people, and there was a warrior class, then you'd split the clergy off from the elites. But these were whole different species of individuals, as different as species of animals. So what nationalism really is this consciousness of yourself as part of a collective. And so right there you have something that's traditionally been associated with the left, which is a kind of collective identity, rather than the really heavy emphasis traditionally, at least on the right, but again, here it's even confusing because you find it in both sides, a very heavy emphasis on individualism.
Going back to your point about Trump being passionate and MLK appealing to people's identities and values, in our beginning of politics class, we look at both Herodotus and Thucydides, and there's a notable difference between them, where Herodotus relies on pathos and maybe even exaggerates the truth a little bit to be a good storyteller and convince people of certain things, while Thucydides takes a more logos-based approach where it's pure facts. No, he's not trying to win the applause of the moment. He's trying to create something that's going to last for all time. Do you think that in today's modern society, where our attention is, everyone is trying to grab our attention, that anyone wanting to create change in a positive or negative sense, do they have to rely on a bit of passion and exaggeration to be heard amongst the sea of other voices?
I mean, I think always some combination of our senses is necessary, some combination of reason and some amount of emotion. I mean, we know that on social media, certainly expressions of a sense of outrage at an injustice is very powerful, but that's not, you don't need to have social media for that. The desire for justice is as old as humans. And similarly, I think fear, being one of the most salient human emotions, is a very powerful trigger. But certainly people try, I think, on social media or in politics to be emotional in ways that don't ring true, that ring false, because it doesn't seem like there's any real logic behind it or reason behind it. People just, emoting, I think, actually lacks real power. It has to be tied up usually with some sort of an argument or some sort of content or some contradiction or something that resonates really deeply. So when I get angry about the violations of free speech, it's not just resonating because I'm angry about it. It's resonating because people really care about free speech. I do think, though, that we've left behind, there was a real strong sense after the post-war era, and you still see it in the establishment, it's still there, really, in the foreign policy establishment of the United States and Europe, where strong expressions of feeling are basically looked down upon as counter to reason. And certainly they can be. Anger, certainly in particular, but fear as well, can undermine reason. But I do think that Trump has opened up or moved the Overton window so that those kinds of expressions of emotion are much more common and accepted by people than they used to be. And I do think that's also part of the return of the strong gods. We might add to the list of strong gods not just nationalism and religion and manliness, but we might also add expressions of vital, passionate feelings as well.
Building on what Eitan was talking about, how we're very individualistic. In our society, I think most Americans would disagree on what an American is, who is an American. Do you think in the next 10, 20 years, our society is going to shift more towards a consensus on what it is to be an American? Or do you think we're going to become more divided where we have a lot of femboys and these people that want to change their gender and be able to control versus these men that want to shift back towards your traditional man, your manly man, your gentleman?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. You put two big ideas together there. One is around manliness, and the other is around citizenship, and they are related, of course. Traditionally, to be a citizen which was traditionally reserved for men, came with all of these responsibilities, including taking care of the city, protecting the city, maintaining the standards of the city, and holding a set of virtues. I definitely think that's coming back. I hope it goes from weak men to gentlemen and doesn't stop at manly men. I think on the issue of citizenship too, I suspect we're going to put more emphasis on citizens. And so you've seen some things which I'm not a fan of, and I'm concerned about using things that people have said as reason to deport them. These are particularly around foreign students here expressing sympathy for Palestinian groups in general and Hamas in particular. I don't want to see free speech used as the justification for that, but I do think that everybody feels like we don't have anything close to the same obligation to a foreign student here on a green card as we do to an American citizen. In general, I think, though, that once you become a citizen, for the most part, Americans kind of go, whether you're naturalized or you're born here, you're a citizen. That makes you fundamentally part of this community. But yeah, I think I would predict to see weaker support for foreign visitors. We obviously saw, or maybe not obviously, but you may know that after months of the Biden administration saying, there's not much Biden and Harris could do to close the border, they closed the border, and now it's the lowest border crossings in 25 years. So, and that has just overwhelming support. Like, you don't see, what's interesting about, things are a consensus because they're the things that nobody talks about. We haven't seen Democrats complain about the border being closed. That just is proof of how strong that consensus now is, in contrast to 2017, when Trump first came in and started making his orders around restrictions of migrants coming here. There was mass protests. I mean, they shut down airports in the United States. This time, you don't even get Democrats going on MSNBC to complain about it. So I do think that we're very polarized still. Particularly see baby boomers just heavily voting on the left, less, a little bit less so with millennials, much less so with Gen Xers, and it looks like Zoomers, Generation Z is also significantly much more committed to those strong gods of nationalism, manliness, citizenship, and kind of keeping some of those boundaries a bit more, the lines, I would say, a bit brighter and stronger.
Guess follow up. Why is it that you think America is so polarized compared to other countries? Is it our freedom of speech that's led to our polarization?
Great question. I think that other countries will become more polarized, and I think that we will also depolarize. So you asked before. I didn't really know if I finished the answer. Are we stuck on these cycles? Is that just how it is? My answer would be yes. If we've been going through cycles, tragic cycles since the Greeks, it's almost certain that we will continue to do that. It doesn't matter that we have the internet or AI. Those things aren't going to change the fundamental, spirit of human nature. In fact, it even seems that we go in these cycles more recently, almost 80-year cycles, 2025 to 1945, 1865 to 1945, 1776, the 80-year period before that. There's something about that period. One might think it is this almost the exact same, length of a human life. That's a full cycle where you see, the two sides change sides. You might have one side that's a little bit more dominant. Like, after World War II, liberals were really dominant. Like, that was, even when you had Republicans in power, it was really liberals. And now you see conservatives exercising much more cultural hegemony. I do think, though, that in other countries, part of it is that, we were controlling Europe, and we still do have controlled Europe in a very big way for a long time. So it's not just that they have weaker support for free speech. It's also that we've really tried to push down on populism in Europe. And so the polarization you've seen here, a lot of it had been in reaction to, there's been a populist reaction, a counter-populist reaction. They hadn't allowed that to occur in Europe. But it looks like if they start to take the responsibility for their own security more and more, that we would see more of the rise of populists and nationalists in Europe, and we would expect to see a similar polarization. Though if I had to bet, I would say we will see a decline in polarization in the United States as Democrats themselves start to embrace a more nationalist vision. That may seem surprising, but I do think that Democrats are basically going to be similar to Republicans in emphasizing national identity, national solidarity as the fundamental place. Some pretty big, important differences maybe than Republicans, but nonetheless, I do think that this heavy period of polarization that we've been in for the last couple of decades will itself also start to resolve over the next 10 or 15 years.
So in our beginning of politics class, we've been learning about the building blocks of a political community as Aristotle defines them, with the husband and wife to the village and then the community. So my question is, what factors do you think have led to the ROGD crisis in the United States, and what steps and initiatives can we take to help parents work around that and really rebuild the foundations of our society?
Oh, wow. ROGD meaning rapid onset gender dysphoria, which many of us think is what caused a lot of particularly adolescent girls to identify as boys. Wow, that's a huge question with a long answer. One thing I will say, though, as it relates to this, is I do think one of the strong gods is family. And that was something that we saw this very globalist, elite, technocratic, expert-driven class really try to get in the way of. In California, for example, they would allow teachers to hide from parents that their daughters might start identifying as boys. That's something as a father of a girl, I would absolutely, not only would I need to know that, I would just be furious if the school kept information like that from me. But the schools felt like they had the right to do that, to get in the way of the sacred bond between a father and his daughter, which, as you can imagine, is just something that parents will die to protect. So when you mention strong gods, nothing stronger than a father's care for his children, and to get in the way of that is absolutely shocking, and it shows you how far things got and why people that maybe didn't like Trump at all, and maybe were Democrats even, would end up voting for him. I think the roots of it are, the basics of how a social contagion have been pretty well known for a number of decades. When I was a boy, anorexia was eating disorder and bulimia that was actually spread by doctors talking about other girls having it and warning against it. So just to wrap your mind around that, it was people warning against this disorder that created the disorder. That's how sensitive young women in particular, there's something about that age. It's very social. Young women at that age, I think young men too, maybe more with young women, have a real intense desire to have identity and to have some sense of belonging. And clearly that was an internet-driven phenomenon where girls who were struggling with anxiety, depression, maybe autism, maybe even even same-sex attraction, though it appears that anxiety and autism were probably bigger factors, spending way too much time online and really being sucked into what I think can only be described as a cult or a high-control group, where people are really brainwashing them and convincing them of providing really easy answers for their problems. There's puberty for some girls in particular can be very uncomfortable and can create a lot of discomfort. And so if you have somebody that's saying, I have an instant remedy for your discomfort, and it's that you're the wrong sex and we should change your sex, very sinister, really. And when you think about it, and also a testament to how weak those family ties and community ties became, that these complete strangers would be able to persuade a young woman that she was the opposite sex and that was the cause of her distress. The other interesting thing, just to bring it all full circle, the other interesting thing about that particular case, when you interview parents that had a daughter that suffered from rapid onset gender dysphoria, one of the things that they'll tell you is that they only were able to stop it when the father came in and said, no, we're not going to block her puberty or put her on testosterone or allow any surgeons. It really took the men finding their manliness and coming back in touch with their manliness to stop it. It's not to say that it didn't happen with some mothers, but in the cases that we looked at, it was often the men who were like, no, we're not going to allow this. And so some of my students, we have one of the key ideas that we had this term was decadence, and the students would be like, what is decadence? Like, what does that even mean? And I would say it's best just summarized with the expression, good times make weak men, make bad times, and I think and then bad times make strong men. So you see that is the full cycle. And I think that we've been coming out of an era of weak men that explains the rapid onset gender dysphoria just as much as the internet and the anxiety crisis among young people does. Thank you guys.